Welcome to the talk on scientific writing. I am Professor Harbinder Jeet Singh from the Department of Physiology, Faculty of Medicine, University Technology, Mara. What I hope to do in this presentation is to first very briefly highlight the importance of writing and publishing, and then go on to talk about some important considerations when preparing a manuscript for publication. In particular, on how to write an original scientific manuscript. What do we understand by scientific writing? Scientific writing can be described as scholarly publications of views, thoughts, analysis of research findings, written primarily for the information of scientific, academic, or lay communities. Scientific writings or publications serve a number of purposes or functions. I can think of at least 6 of them. To begin with, it creates or forms or provides a system of communication between people with common interests. It helps disseminate knowledge in addition to stimulating the growth of research and knowledge for the betterment of science and mankind in general. For example, in 1984, Marshall and Warren, in their publication, pointed to a correlation between ulcer disease and Campylobacter pylorides. This led to enormous interest in this organism, so much so between 1992 and 2002, more than 16,000 papers were published on this subject, and more than 1,000 clinical trials were conducted. Apart from this, scientific writing also provides an opportunity for optimal usage of archived information. In fact, it becomes part of history or provides a historical perspective. For example, we talk about Helicobacter pylori. The link between infection and peptic ulcer disease was already proposed way back in 1916 and was investigated as early as 1923. The effect of dental care on the occurrence of peptic ulcer was observed long before the discovery of the role of H. pylori in peptic ulcer disease. Apart from all these, scientific writing also raises an institute's academic status. As you know, these days, university rankings include the research and publication of the staff at those institutes. So it's a very important activity in any institute of higher learning. In addition to that, of course, it also provides for personal academic development. You may have heard about this saying, publish or perish. So any promotions in academia require academics to be writing and publishing. And finally, of course, by writing and publishing, you can also claim ownership to idea or findings or even an invention. Right, to produce a good publishable manuscript, it is important that the subject is topical and has a relevant research problem or is a relevant research problem. It must have a good research question, preferably a new question or an old unanswered question. And it must have a correct study methodology. The data has to be collected meticulously. All these actually help to produce a good manuscript. And finally, to be able to present the findings clearly and persuasively with good reference to existing literature. My talk this morning will mainly center on how to write a manuscript. Now that you have completed your laboratory work and you have analyzed the data, you looked at the data, what is it that your data or your results are saying to you? So to begin with, you must actually identify the central message that is coming from your results, the message that you wish to get across to the readers and to the world. So you look at your results very carefully. Look and see what exactly is it that your results are pointing to you. Write down the central points of your paper, right? 1, 2, 3, 4 points, just write them down. And then summarize your paper in 2, 3, or 4 sentences. In fact, you can actually write your conclusion here, the beginnings of your conclusion if you like. And this could form a basis to finally conclude your paper. Alternatively, you may want to try and describe your work to a colleague in 1 or 2 minutes. Once you are able to do that, and you know exactly what is it that you want to write about, you identify the journal in which you would like to have your work published. Once you have identified the journal, get the guidelines. You read the guidelines. Most journals provide instruction to authors on how to prepare a manuscript and what is it that they require you to have in the manuscript and how to format that manuscript. It's very useful for beginners. Once you've got that organized, the next thing you do would be to compose a tentative title. You compose it early. You may want to re-examine it and fine-tune it later, but it's nice to have the title composed very early. And when you're composing your title, you can make one of the keywords as the first word of your title, if possible. Don't make the title too long. It should be short, specific. It should not be general. For example, if you have examined the effect of losartan on blood pressure, and you found that losartan decreased blood pressure. Now, you don't want to write or compose a title that would say effect of losartan on blood pressure because it tells you nothing. Was there an increase? Was there a decrease? Or was there no effect? But what you can do is you can actually write losartan decreases blood pressure. So the message is already in the title. So that's an important factor to consider when you're composing a title. So therefore you remove waste or redundant words like the, on, investigation, and so forth. You don't need to have these words. At the same time, when you're composing your title, you must make sure your title matches the research question, the design, and the findings. Now, all original manuscripts begin with an introduction. And what is the purpose of the introduction? I find that if you know what the purpose is, you will be able to actually construct and compose a very good introduction. What is the purpose of this introduction? First of all, it is to introduce the topic to the reader. And you want to make it such that it will stimulate the reader's interest, and by providing pertinent background, references and what have you. All right. And thirdly, of course, the introduction is important because reviewers and editors also read that before they judge the importance of the manuscript. So when writing an introduction, it is important to establish the significance of your work. Why was there a need to conduct this study? You must refer to papers that have direct bearing to the present problem, to your research problem, to your research question. And in the introduction, you must show that the problem that you're investigating actually exists. It has to be shown clearly, all right? You could state the problem, or you must state the problem. Perhaps you could even ask a question. And when preparing an introduction, just quote pertinent references. Do not overquote. Remember, the introduction will determine the interest of the reader and also the response of the editors and the reviewers. So therefore, you must construct the introduction in such a way that it highlights that the problem that you are investigating or going to investigate or you're going to report about actually exists. You don't have to have a long introduction. Just keep your introduction short, 500 to 800 words. So once you've got your introduction done, then you're going to write your materials and methods. In this section, it's very important, all right? It's an important part of the paper as it usually describes the study protocol that has been used to find an answer to your research question. And it's usually scrutinized by editors, by readers, by reviewers. It describes how the results are obtained. Remember, flawed methodology gives flawed results. All right? So make sure that you very clearly describe how the results were obtained. And it should be in sufficient detail for the evaluators to be able to assess the reliability and reproducibility of your results. It should have sufficient details for someone else to repeat the work if they want to repeat your methodology, to make sure that you do not omit any important details. When you write your introduction, your methodology, write what you did in operational order. All right. For example, you do not write carotid artery was cannulated after exposure. We all know that you have to expose the carotid artery first and then cannulate it. So the correct way to write is the carotid artery was exposed and then cannulated. So as I mentioned just now, you must be very concise in your description of the methodology, but at the same time, you must make sure that you do not omit essential details. Now, you do not have to mention things like the results were analyzed using a computer. As we know these days, all of us use computers for analysis, unless, of course, there was a specific computer that you had used, a specialized computer of some sort, yes, but otherwise there is no need to. Similarly, you don't have to say weighing was done on a balance because we know you have to use a balance. But if there was a special balance that you had to use, particularly for this study, yes, then you need to mention the balance, the model or the make, and the country of origin. Now, if you have used controls, make sure that it is clearly indicated. There is no doubt about their nature. Sometimes the readers may not be able to guess what is, what are the controls and what you have omitted and what you have, left out, if you like. So make sure that you clearly identify your control groups and your experimental groups. If your paper is mainly on a new method, you can ask a colleague or a technician to test your description. Ask them to read the description and then apply the method in your absence to see if they can reproduce the methodology and the results. If description of materials that you have used is short and the materials are not that many, you include the materials straight in the method. So you don't have to list them out separately. All right? You include them in the method. As you're writing the methods, you can actually write the materials. But always at the end, bracket, for example, you must provide the name of manufacturer and the country of origin. Provide complete details of the statistical tests that were used for the analysis of data. Now, this is very important. Sometimes you do come across manuscripts, they do not clearly indicate what kind of statistical tests were used. All right, so it's very important that the right statistical tests are used for the study design. And lastly, do not forget to include information on ethical clearance. And this is an important aspect that many people forget sometimes. And a lot of rejections of papers because of not inclusion of this ethical clearance. Now you have done your materials and methods section. The next thing to do is to write your results. Of course, you would have plotted your results out. All right, you probably would have had the tables and the figures. But how do you lay them out in the manuscript? Plan the tables and figures to ensure that the way you sequence them, all right, so that sequence tells a story. So the reader will be able to follow the results and there is a story to it. You summarize your findings in the text and point the reader to the relevant data in the figures or the tables. You do not repeat the data that is already in the figures and tables in the text. All right, you don't have to, you must not. In short, what the text should do is basically what you write, it should complement. So the text should complement the figures or the tables. Do not repeat the same information in the text, what is already available in the figures or the tables. And similarly, you must always decide what data is it that you want to present in tables and what is it that you want to present in figures, because you should not be duplicating data in both figures and tables. Use the past tense when you refer to your results. Generally, what we'd expect is the tables and figures should be clear and they can be understood without reference to the text. In other words, if somebody just sees the table or the figure, they would be able to capture what the table and the figure is imparting. You do not need to provide replicate observations. All right? Sometimes we have observations made in triplicate or duplicate. You do not need to. It's better to just provide the median, mode, or mean, and the variability. So if you want to state the degree of freedom, place it in parentheses. And giving the range is not always necessary. And when you are writing date, month, and year, the sequence should proceed from large to small. What I mean here is you start with the year, the month, the day, hour, and minute in that order. Always use SI units. And units named after people are spelled without a capital, whereas symbols of such units have to be in capitals. When you write a series of values, do not repeat the unit. For example, write 30 and 40 grams, and not 30 grams and 40 grams. When you're writing time of the day, it should be given in the 24-hour system. Dates are usually written without stops. And it's also better to quantify your data whenever possible. Use quantitative rather than qualitative descriptions. For example, growth rate at 35 degrees Celsius incubation was 10% faster or higher than growth rate at 20 degrees Celsius incubation. This is much more precise than the more qualitative phrase like growth rate was faster at a higher temperature of incubation. Now that you have got your results written out, the next thing to do is to write a discussion. Now, what is the purpose of the discussion? Why do you need the discussion? In the discussion, you state your interpretation, your opinion of your results. That is the major purpose of the discussion. You state your interpretation and opinion of the results that you have obtained. At the same time, you explain the implications of your findings. You show how your findings fit into the existing body of knowledge. And of course, you can also make suggestions for future research. Your results or findings, in fact, are the answer to your research question. All right? That's what your findings are. So you have answered the question, and now you want to actually show how this answer fits into the existing body of knowledge and what are its implications. All right? Now, before you start a discussion, one of the things to do is to develop an outline. All right? And this outline should help you to present your interpretation. Remember, it's a message that you want to convey, and there is a story that you want to tell. All right? So how do you plan it out? So you can have an outline first. Right? So you can then present your interpretations logically. So you organize the discussion from specific to general. Now, what do I mean by specific to general? You always start your discussion from your findings. Right? Findings to the literature. Right? You don't have to restate your results per se, your what you have got in your results, but what is the findings? All right? Right? You write your findings and then relate it to the literature. From literature, you relate it to theory. And then from theory to practice wherever possible. Right? So these should be the sequence in this order. Your findings, you relate it to the literature in the discussion, from the literature to theory, and theory to practice. And use present tense. You explain in your discussion how your results support the answers and how the answers fit into the existing knowledge on the topic. You address all the results relating to the questions. All right. Usually, whatever results you have in the paper, they have to be referred to in the discussion. All right. So you only include or you don't include results that are not related to the research question. So all results that are in the results section have to be discussed, regardless of whether or not the findings are statistically significant. And as I mentioned just now, don't just restate or write a summary of your results. In the discussion, you actually provide a commentary on your results or of your results. You enlarge upon the significance of your results and explain how they add or fit in the previously published knowledge on the topic. You don't have to have your discussion very lengthy. Usually, for the standard original papers, a discussion that is about 1500 to 1800 words is usually sufficient. Once you have come to the end of your discussion, you now write the conclusion. Of course, if you had started your paper by writing the conclusion first, you can now bring your conclusion back and revise the conclusion. All right. Your conclusion should be directly supported by the data that you present. All right. So you do not conclude on things that are not in your data. Usually, your conclusion should be directly supported by the data that you present. You avoid making sweeping conclusions that rest on assumptions that have not been substantiated by your data or others' research. For example, if you discover that leptin increases blood pressure and proteinuria in your study on rats, you would not necessarily conclude that this will be the case in all animals and even humans. You may draw this conclusion if you cite evidence that this has also been found in 20 other mammalian species. But if there is no evidence, you cannot make that conclusion. So the best thing to do would be to just write, excuse me, leptin increases blood pressure and proteinuria in the rats. If you like, you can also mention the dose of leptin or how it was given, if you like, in your conclusion. So you are being specific. Your conclusion is based solely on your findings. All right? So always assess the generality of the available data before you commit to any overly general conclusion. Now, once you have got your conclusion done, the next thing you want to do is to write a summary or abstract of a manuscript. And what is this? An abstract or a summary is the condensed version of the manuscript, which highlights the major points in the manuscript. And many readers will actually read the abstract first before they read the main manuscript. So you have to make sure that the manuscript is very concise, all right, and it concisely describes the content and scope of the content of the paper. All right, so this is very important. So before you start preparing your abstract or summary, read the guidelines provided by the publisher. They will tell you how to write or how they would want the format of the abstract and also the word limit. You have written a paper, so by now you would know what is important, what is it that you want to get across. So identify the major aims and conclusions, identify the major methods, and identify the major results that you want to include in the abstract or in the summary, and assemble the above information into a single paragraph. Usually the summary is written in one paragraph, but as I said, you look at the publisher's guidelines, all right, and prepare it as they request, whether they want it structured or they want it in one paragraph, all right. State the problem or hypothesis in the first sentence, followed by the aim and very briefly what you did. Omit background information. You don't need to have literature review and detailed description of methods. As I mentioned just now, you pick out the major methods that you need to put in. All right. You state the major results. Now, when you're writing results, you don't need to list values unless they are extremely necessary. Use words instead. And here I mean you can say whether it has increased or decreased or no change, higher or lower. This is what you would do. You don't have to actually give the values in the abstract unless it's extremely necessary and important. And state your conclusion in the last couple of lines or in the last paragraph. So say don't make the summary too long, follow the guidelines. All right. Most journals have a guideline on the word limit as well. And when you write the summary, you write it in past tense, except perhaps the last paragraph. Once you have written it, read it and see if you can, if there are extra words or there are some inappropriate words, so you do the necessary revision. So if I may summarize the steps when writing a scientific manuscript. First of all, before you start writing, make sure you have identified the core message that you wish to communicate to the readers. After that, you identify or select the journal in which you wish to publish your results, or the journal that you think will be interested in publishing your manuscript. Once you've done that, you sit, think and plan. You visualize, you imagine the article in total, how it will look like. Create a temporary or tentative title. All right, so as I mentioned earlier, you can create a tentative title from the start itself, from the beginning. And towards the end, later on, of course, you can fine-tune it and make it more specific, if you like, if necessary. You map out the headings. You have your tables and figures organized. All right, as I mentioned just now, you should organize them in such a way that they actually tell a story. All right, then they will be able to convey the message that you wish to convey. And you write your first draft. Right? So you have your first draft. Once you have completed your first draft, you put your script aside for a few days or a couple of weeks. Don't look at it. Don't think about it. And after that short break, you come back, you relook at your manuscript. But this time you look at it very critically. Look at it as if it is written by somebody else, not by you. And then you do the necessary editing. Look at the flow. How is the flow? Is it telling a nice story? Is the story flowing? Are there any hanging sentences? Are there any redundant statements? If they are, you remove them. You edit your manuscript. After you have done that, you give your manuscript to a colleague or a friend to read and take their feedback seriously. Okay? Check on copyright laws. All right? We don't want to be found infringing any copyright laws. And always reread your manuscript before you submit it to the journal. Now, I hope you find these tips useful. Now, what I've learned over the years is that one of the best ways to learn how to write a manuscript is by reading a lot of good scientific papers. When you read them, you just not only read them for their content, but you also pay attention to the way the introduction has been constructed. Look at the way the methods are written. Look at the way how the results are presented. They are sequencing, etc., etc. Right? What I mean here is scientific papers that have been published in high impact factor journals and written by authorities on the subjects, if you like, some very well-known, experienced researchers and writers. So when you look at that, right, and then you look at the discussion and see how they have composed the discussion, how they have done it to get across the findings or the central message of their paper. I can assure you, if you do this regularly, initially, you start doing that, after a while, you will become quite fluent in it. In fact, I can assure you that you will become good at writing manuscripts. Happy writing. And thank you for your attention.